Greetings, friends. Imagine this, a dark street, a quiet evening, and suddenly there is the sound of screeching brakes and a thud. The driver, gripped by hatred and prejudice, steps on the gas and hits a defenseless elderly man simply because he is of a different skin color. But he had no idea how this cruel act would turn out for him. What do you think? What dire consequences await him? Write right now in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. Your thoughts and participation are incredibly important to us. Each of your comments helps to promote our channel, to make it stronger, and to make us closer to each other. You are not just viewers, you are part of our team, part of our family, and we appreciate you being with us. Buckle up, because there's a story ahead that will give you goosebumps. Are you ready to find out what happened when the driver realized who this man was and who his son was? Let's dive into this drama together. Enjoy the show. The night was deep, silent and ominous. The deserted street, lit by sparse lanterns, seemed lifeless, as if forgotten by the world. The houses along the road were dark and silent. The windows were empty eye sockets staring straight into nothingness. Somewhere in the distance, the wind was howling, gusts of it rolling withered leaves across the asphalt as if they were living shadows, slowly sliding and disappearing into the gloom. The air was strangely heavy and damp, with an almost suffocating odor of dirty asphalt and burning oil from passing cars. The silence thickened and grew dense, as if space itself was shrinking, preparing to let in something inevitably terrible. At such moments, the city revealed its dark interior. The streets ceased to be roads, becoming a ribbon of tents and dissipation, like silent witnesses who knew that something terrible was about to happen. A light fog enveloped the road like a ghostly river, and the streetlights illuminated it, giving the haze an eerie orange tint. The headlights of a car loomed in the distance, a lone light cutting through the gloom like a predatory stare pointed straight ahead. The sound of the engine was barely audible, but it grew with each passing moment, filling the street with a low, menacing roar. The sound overpowered everything. There was no more whisper of wind, no more light rustling of leaves, only the heavy roar of the car, ripping through the silence like an inevitable harbinger of trouble. And as soon as the headlights came closer, the asphalt seemed to shudder, foreboding trouble. Moments remained before the inevitable collision, before the moment when the grim silence would be broken by violence. The driver sat behind the wheel, his hands clenched tightly on the cold leather rim, his joints white with tension, his mind swirling with dark, poisonous thoughts. As soon as he spotted the old man on the curb, walking slowly home, something inside him clicked like a long winding mechanism. Anger rose like a dark cloud, and his eyes flashed with hatred. He felt like a hunter out on the trail of prey, almost enjoying what he saw before him. A stranger on his street, with no right to be here. A man whose presence felt like a growing pressure on his heart, on his mind. I'm so sick of them, he thought grimly as he looked at the silhouette slowly pacing along the road. Why is he here in the first place? Why can't he stay in his own neighborhood? In every word he spoke, in every mental sigh, a blind rage grew, simmering, fueled by the prejudiced beliefs he'd absorbed. It seemed, since childhood, they're always whining about their rights, but they don't even think they got everything they could long ago. How they love to complain, to pretend they're victims, as if the world owes them forgiveness and understanding. He grinned irritably, feeling the rage turn to determination. The phrases he had often heard from mothers like him ring in his head. And now, in the dark of night, where no one would see him, his hatred was no longer contained. It was becoming something personal, deeply ingrained, almost justified. That old man, he spat mentally, is as pathetic as the rest of them, walking along like nothing's wrong, like he can just cross my path, like he can't see that he's an extra. His whole being was seething with hatred, with a sense of superiority that he cherished as his inalienable right. He loved this feeling of power, the sense that his machine and his will could decide the fate of another man. This isn't just any old man, he thought, gripping the steering wheel even tighter. It's a symbol of everything I despise, everything that's ruining this city, our lives. Images flashed through his mind, poisoned by the fear he used to justify his hatred. What if he's one of the ones committing crimes? Who is polluting our society? He convinced himself, whipping up fear and disgust, turning those thoughts into a new round of aggression. What does he even think of himself, showing up here like he owns everything he sees? And those proud looks of theirs, that insolence, he deserves to be shown his place. These thoughts swelled in his mind, fueling his hatred, pushing the gas harder and harder, as if his hatred itself were driving the car forward. His gaze, full of contempt and blind malice, was directed only at the lone figure, and at that moment, nothing else existed for him but the dark pleasure of knowing that now he could exact his revenge. An elderly man walked slowly along the deserted road, leaning on a cracked wooden cane. His steps were leisurely, tired, as if with each step he was overcoming the weight of his own life, which he had carried on his shoulders year after year. He looked frail, but in that frailty there was a resilience that is rare in our time. The years had made his figure a little stooped, his shoulders a little slumped, but there was something dignified and wise about it, as if he had become part of the streets he had walked for decades. The old man was dressed modestly but neatly, a long dark coat with slightly worn sleeves, patched in several places, a warm, albeit old-fashioned, scarf wrapped around his neck to protect him from the chilling night wind. On his head he wore an old hat, slightly battered but with neatly raised brim, giving him the appearance of a respectable man, as if from a photograph of a bygone era. His skin was dark, covered with wrinkles that weren't just signs of age. Each one told of the hardships he'd endured, the things he'd seen and been through. These wrinkles spoke of years spent in a world that had not always been kind to him. His eyes, deep and warm, looked forward, reflecting peace and tired wisdom. There was something special in them, the look of a man who had seen both good and bad, but had learned to appreciate the simple pleasures of life. As he stepped onto the road, it was as if he was unaware of the presence of the evil that was looming over him. He was completely absorbed in his own thoughts, perhaps of the home he was walking so confidently toward, of the warm hearth, of the family that awaited his return. His every step seemed slow but measured, as if it were important to him to maintain this calm movement without disturbing either his silence or the peace of the world around him. He had no anxiety, no expectation of danger. Like a man who has gone through years of hardship and learned to look forward with easy hope, no matter what for him. This night was just one of many through which he had walked with the same unshakable calm. The headlights of the car, cutting through the darkness, revealed the figure of an old man walking slowly along the curb. The driver spotted him at once, an elderly black man, lonely, vulnerable, completely absorbed in his own thoughts. This scene would seem to most to be just a random encounter, but in the driver's eyes it became a target, the object of his perverse hatred. The driver's lips twitched, forming into a ghastly, contemptuous smile. He grimaced, as if he had seen something disgusting. Something beneath him were the only of his derision and contempt. A gloating feeling flared up in his heart mixed with that old, ingrained hatred that had poisoned his mind for years. It seemed to him that this man, this pathetic, slow-walking old man, had invaded his privacy, his world, where he had not invited him. Races and poison thoughts raced through the driver's mind as echoes of hatred filled his consciousness. Here he is, walking himself, thinking he can just walk through here, like he has a right to. He thought in disgust. His fingers clenched on the steering wheel and rage flashed in his eyes. How long can we put up with them? They walk among us, live next to us, as if that's the way it's supposed to be, as if they had a right to do so. The evil grin widened on his face, turning it into a sinister mask, and he could barely contain the laughter that burst from his chest. Anticipating what was about to happen, fear was not for him. That was the lot of men like this old man. He felt taller, stronger, and the fear and despair he could inspire only made him stronger. There was no room for doubt or pity in his soul, which was soaked with hatred. He knew that he needed no excuses or reasons. It was enough. What he wanted enough, his desire to humiliate and destroy. His gaze rested on the figure of the old man, who was unaware of the attention that had fallen upon him from the depths of the night. The driver cast him a contemptuous, appraising glance, as if deciding how best to sneak up on him, how to enjoy the moment when this man would realize that he was prey in that instant. Images of the victim's fear and defenselessness came into his mind, and his chest filled with the eerie, dark joy of realizing his power. He slowed down, waiting, anticipating this moment. Every second was building up in his mind like dark, choking smoke about to burst forth. He was a predator lurking in the shadows, about to descend suddenly and mercilessly upon his prey. The driver inhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment when his decision was just taking shape. gradually growing into an obsession. A grim transformation was taking place inside him. Thoughts swarmed in his head, vicious, hate-soaked and racist, poisoning every second of his contemplation. He felt a wave of rage and superiority rising in him, mixed with a false confidence that he was right. He deserved it, he repeated mentally, convincing himself more and more. All these people do is take advantage of us, meddle in our business, think they can live among us as equals. His thoughts carried a distinct tinge of contempt and disdain, feeding off the stereotypes and prejudices he had absorbed over the years. He found in them supposedly proof of his rightness, each argument in his head as if pushing him to action, to a decision that would show him who was strong, who was the real master of the situation. How dare they, walking our streets, acting like they're allowed to do anything, they've forgotten their place. Those words sounded like an incantation in his mind, making his resolve stronger and his intention firmer, more inevitable. The image of the old man had formed in his mind, not as a man, but as a symbol of everything he hated, and that feeling, that lingering anger, seemed more than enough reason for him to take the step. He imagined how the old man would look up, the horror in his eyes the moment he realized his life was over. That grim anticipation energized his adrenaline, fueled his determination. It seemed to him that he was doing something right, that what he was doing was a kind of punishment that people like him should have suffered long ago. Mentally he excused himself again and again. No one will know, he thought. No one will say a word, because that's the way it has to be. Maybe it will serve as a lesson. They'll realize they can't act like they're allowed to do everything. He believed in his superiority as an undeniable truth that justified any act, no matter how cruel and inhuman. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. His skin taut and his joints white with tension. There was a sinister grin on his face, devoid of any hint of doubt or pity. He could feel a wild, almost primal anger brewing inside him, ready to erupt with force. All he had to do was push down on the pedal and let himself go. For a moment his gaze became hard, cold and indifferent. He had made up his mind, and now there were no barriers, no moral constraints. With a jerk he sank the gas pedal to the floor, and the car roared as if it sensed his ruthless intent. The engine rumbled, filling the empty street with an ominous, heavy echo. The car sped off like a beast, and the driver savored how the power of his iron horse responded to his desire, accelerating with each passing moment. The lines of the road became a solid blur, the darkness a tunnel through which he raced toward his victim. The figure of the old man flashed before his eyes, as if mesmerized by this bright light from the gloom of the night. The old man had neither chance nor time to realize what was happening. The driver saw him keep moving forward, unaware that in a moment he would have nowhere to run. The hum of the engine grew louder and louder, filling everything around him, overpowering even the sound of his own breathing and the pounding of his heart. It was a sound of mercilessness, a sound that carried nothing but destruction. There was no regret in that sound, no mercy, just the icy ruthlessness of a man who had decided to do things his own way, no matter what the cost. Every moment brought him closer to his goal, and with every meter that shortened the distance between him and the old man, he felt a growing excitement. The anticipation of the clash, violent, final, was burning him from within like fire. At the moment he was indifferent to everything except one single thought: to show this man that he had no right to be here, on his street, in his world. The car was rushing forward with monstrous force, and everything around Francie in an ominous premonition of impending disaster. The car sped forward, roaring like an angry beast, and the distance between it and the old man was reduced to a few meters. The driver saw that the figure of the old man, illuminated by the headlights, suddenly Francie, enveloped in the bright light, as if terrified at the impending danger. A moment, one brief instant, and suddenly a violent blow. The metal body of the machine crashed with monstrous force into the old man's body. There was a muffled, eerie sound, a heavy, wet crumpling sound, as if something dense and living had been crushed overnight. The air was filled with muffled, barely audible screams, short, interrupted by the impact, as if the air itself had been torn from the old man's lungs for the last time. The old man's body flew into the air, like a broken doll from the force of the blow. His arms and legs flew apart as if losing control, devoid of life. His cane, which he held so confidently, flew out of his hand and hit the pavement, rolling as if symbolizing the quiet life he was leaving behind. Time seemed to stand still in that moment, flouncing over his figure, hovering for a moment above the road, as if weightless, but at the same time utterly defenseless against an inexorable force. Then the body collapsed to the pavement with a thud, as lifeless as a rag doll left in the middle of a deserted street. The driver heard the sound of the impact with the ground, felt the vibration roll across the road, as if the earth itself had shuddered from the violence. For a moment, silence enveloped the street, filling the space between him and the victim, as if time itself did not know how to react to this brutality. The driver's gaze fell on the broken figure of an old man lying motionless on the cold asphalt. Dark, thick blood trickled from under his body, spreading in directions, filling the cracks in the road, leaving the imprint of the night like an indelible stain. The blood slowly spread, soaking into the asphalt, a red mark that stared mutely at the man behind the wheel, cold and indifferent. The car stopped, and the driver continued to sit in the cab, with a frowning evil grin, not even touched by a shadow of regret. It seemed to him that everything had gone according to plan, that his act was something almost natural. All around him, in the silence of the night, there was only a quiet, continuous dripping, as if the night itself were crying, washing away the consequences of his monstrous act. The car door opened with a clang, and the driver, slowly and with deliberate indifference, stepped out onto the cold asphalt, casting a thin shadow behind him in the light of the street lamps. He took a few steps forward, as if taking his time, stretching out the moment, breathing in the night air, saturated with metal and something else he couldn't or wouldn't give a name to. His gaze, cold and unblinking, fell on the old man's body, lying in a strange, unnatural pose on the road. He looked down from above, the way one looks at unwanted garbage or a stray animal, in which no one sees any pain or fear. His eyes, squinted and sharp, were full of humiliating contempt. He saw not a person, but a faceless object that had no meaning to him. It was indifference mixed with disgust, a racist, blind conviction that before him lay something that had no right to respect, that did not deserve the slightest fraction of human treatment. His face, as if frowning in an icy mask, barely trembled with a slight chuckle, and that chuckle said it all. Just another one of them, he thought, and the thought gave him a false sense of satisfaction and power. Does anyone really grieve for them? All they do is ruin our world. His thoughts were muffled, each one giving off a venom of prejudice and hatred. He leaned a little closer, not with interest or compassion, but as if to make sure of his superiority. He was disgusted, even to look at this man, but in that contempt, he felt a kind of sick, dark pleasure, as if this act of violence justified his hatred. He stood like that, feeling victorious, feeling that he had finally put someone in his place. There was not a shred of doubt in his gaze, not a spark of regret, only icy, soulless, merciless contempt, a look that seemed to wipe this man off the face of the earth, stripping him of his last shred of human dignity. Lying on the cold asphalt, the old man slowly came to his senses. His body was shattered, every bone seemed to have shattered into pieces, but in this state, he still felt an inner core that would not let him give up. Through his dimming gaze, he saw before him the black boots of the driver who stood over him. In that look, in that near death, he felt the depth of the coldness with which he was looked down upon as something unworthy of either help or pity. Gathering his last strength, the old man slowly, with effort, raised his head. His eyes, dimmed with pain but still full of inner dignity, met the cold, disparaging gaze of the driver. He felt his life slowly ebbing away and knew that these words might be the last he would ever say. The old man coughed, and a thin trickle of blood ran down his lips, staining his chin purple. He knew that every word could be his last, and in that moment his voice sounded hoarse, weak but also unbroken. Looking into the eyes of his assailant, he uttered, in a trembling but firm voice, "You think you've won? That you're stronger than me, but you know, it's not up to you to decide whose life has value." The driver frowned, but not a muscle in his face quivered. The old man, in spite of the pain, continued to speak, and there was an eerie, ominous power in his voice, as if the words came not from his mouth, but from his very soul. "You are weak if you need to humiliate others to feel strong." He struggled with each word, as if he were tearing them from the depths of his exhausted body. But there was no fear in those words. There was a doomed but harsh truth in them that seemed to penetrate the driver's mind. forcing him to face what he really was. Someone will always be stronger than you, and one day you'll have to answer for everything you've done. His voice faded, but those last words hung in the air like a prophecy. The old man closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain, but even in that moment, there was not an ounce of pleading, not a spark of forgiveness. He simply walked away, taking the last words with him, a message that carried with it the full horror that one day there would be a reckoning. That driver, standing over him, felt a chill creep into his heart. The old man's gaze, his last words, spoken with trembling and inexpressible calmness, began to penetrate his consciousness like poisonous needles. For a moment, it seemed to him that somewhere far away, in the depths of the night, there was a low, barely audible moan, as if the night itself had responded to the dying man's last words. The driver returned to his car without turning back, and grinned as he got behind the wheel. He didn't even bother to hide the smile that slid across his lips, as if this moment belonged to him alone, as if it were his personal victory. As he turned the key in the ignition, he heard the soothing rumble of the engine, as if the car itself was supporting him in this violent rush. His heart beat faster not from fear or regret, but from a grim, inner exultation, from the realization that he had left behind him a man he thought was insignificant and weak. A dark, angry joy pulsed inside him. It filled him, penetrating every corner of his mind. He was pleased with himself. His act seemed to him something almost natural. That's it, he thought, curving his lips again in a satisfied grin. Now he knows his place. Now they'll all know not to just walk down these streets like they're allowed to. The thought warmed him like a rare spark of pleasure he didn't often experience. He convinced himself that his actions would bring him no consequences. No one was in sight. The street was empty, and the darkness hid everything. Will just disappear like so many before him. He pondered with cynical certainty. 1 in 1,000. No one will even remember his name. The thought gave him an unhealthy feeling of superiority, a sense of impunity that spilled over his body like adrenaline, awakening euphoria. His gloating had become almost palpable. It was beating inside him, pulsing with the rhythm of the motor that was building up, driving him away from the scene of the crime. He felt victorious, master of that situation, a man who had done what he thought was right and thought nothing of the consequences. Who can prove it? Who's going to care? They won't even look into it. He continued mentally, justifying his impunity, as if the world was on his side and everything that happened was subject to his will. With each mile, he drove away from the body lying on the road. He felt the fear recede, replaced by a sense of complete control. It seemed to him that he had erased this man from his life, from his world, forever, and now he could drive on as if nothing had happened. The driver continued driving, pushing the gas pedal to the limit, as if he wanted to leave as far behind as possible not only the scene of the accident, but also what he had just done. But his thoughts wouldn't let him go, beating in his mind, insistently reminding him of that night, of the dark figure of the old man lying on the pavement. He felt some unpleasant pressure growing in his chest, strange and incomprehensible, but he did not allow himself to give in to it. Instead, he tried hard to convince himself that he had done the right thing. He deserves it, he convinced himself over and over, as if casting a spell. They all deserve it. These people, they've driven themselves to the point where someone has to show them their place. These thoughts calmed him for a moment, but immediately the restless shadows of doubt returned. His own consciousness seemed to slip out of control, insistently reminding him that there was a man left out there on the road, not just a silhouette, not an abstract enemy, but a living human being. He gritted his teeth. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter again, and he pushed even harder on the gas, trying to drown out those thoughts. It was necessary, he kept saying. Someone had to do it. They don't understand any other way. I'm the one protecting them. I'm protecting my world from them. He himself did not realize that his attempts to justify the act were growing more desperate, that the words no longer seemed as convincing as they had at the moment of the act itself. In the back of his mind, something told him that his explanations were invalid, that behind the dark veil of these excuses lay a simpler truth. He had committed a cruel, inhuman act. He wanted to forget it, to erase it from his memory, but it came back again and again, those eyes of the old man, full of reproachful truth, that look that penetrated his soul and foretold his retribution. He slapped the steering wheel with force, trying to drown out that voice inside him. No, he had to go. They should all know their place. He almost shouted into the void, as if those words could convince not only him but the world around him that he was right. He knew that he would never tell anyone about it, knew that he could never justify his act to others, but he kept assuring himself that inside he had acted as a protector, as one who acts in the name of justice. But in spite of all these thoughts, he knew that the truth he had tried to insinuate into himself was gone. It was only a ghost, a fading echo that could not drown out the dark, restless feeling that was gradually taking hold of him. The next morning, the driver woke up with his usual sense of calm, almost certain that the night's incident had been left behind like a bad dream, like something that was forever in the darkness. But his illusions were quickly dispelled as soon as he turned on the television to look at the morning news. Footage of the street where he had left the old man the night before flashed on the screen. The familiar outline of the road, the ominous lilac strip bounded by police tape, and the faces of the reporters, tense and serious. He realized at once that the news concerned him, that his deed had not fallen into silence as he had hoped. The presenter, stern and reserved, spoke to the screen with professional sympathy in her voice. The body of an elderly man was found this morning, allegedly the victim of a hit and run on a deserted street last night. The identity of the deceased has already been established. He is a local resident, a veteran known in the area as a kind-hearted and respected man. Police are treating this as a premeditated crime and are asking for witnesses to come forward. His heart clenched, and images began to flash through his mind that he didn't want to admit even to himself. The old man lying on the road, his trembling but firm words to the driver before he died, and the blood slowly spreading across the asphalt, leaving a trail that no one would ever be able to erase. This was no longer just a random accident, but a real drama that was on the radar of the entire city. The screen showed a close-up of the old man's picture, the same look of kindness and wisdom that he had hated and now could not resist. Those eyes stared back at him from the screen, as if they were penetrating deep into his soul, rebuking him for what he had done, making him feel again and again the oppression from which he had tried to escape. The reporter continued, a look of anger and indignation now spreading across her face. This brutal act has shocked local residents. Police suggest that the hit and run was particularly brutal and may have been witnessed by bystanders. The collection of any data and evidence that may lead to the capture of the perpetrator has already been announced. At this time, the investigation is being handled as a priority case, and the city promises to do everything possible to ensure the perpetrator receives the punishment he deserves. The words, "the culprit is being punished," echoed in his head like a thunderclap. He felt his calm dissolve, giving way to a growing fear and the realization that what he had thought hidden in the darkness of the night was now coming into the light. It seemed to him that with every word the presenter spoke, a beam was directed in his direction, highlighting what he was desperately trying to forget and hide. He turned off the TV, but the words were still echoing in his head. It was becoming clear that this act was not going to go away, that the night's secret had gone public, and now he was going to pay a price, not the kind he'd imagined. Sitting at the kitchen table, the driver turned on the television again. He wanted to find out what else was known about the incident, even though he already knew that any new word would only increase the heaviness that had been hanging over him since the moment he had seen his victim's face on the screen. He gave up and continued watching, trying to convince himself that everything could still go unnoticed, that maybe no one would ever know the truth. The news anchor appeared on the screen again, and next to him was the very picture of the old man he could barely stand. The anchor spoke in a subdued tone, but his voice was imbued with a respect and pain that sent a chill down the driver's spine. Local veteran and prominent resident of our town, Mr. Joseph Williams, was found dead after a heinous hit and run last night. The announcer began. Mr. Williams, who had dedicated his entire life to serving his community, helping those in need and charity work, was the victim of this brutal crime. Neighbors and friends remember him as a kind, wise and fair man who always took the time to help those less fortunate. The driver frowned, feeling his body cover with cold sweat. Mr. Williams, the name hit his consciousness like a blow. It was a name that was well known in their neighborhood, a man who had spent his entire life dedicated to helping people, participating in charity events, building orphanages, and organizing free soup kitchens. It seemed that everyone in town had some story about Mr. Williams, about his kindness and involvement. The driver felt something clench inside him, but he still tried to wave it away, excusing himself. So what? He tried to mentally reassure himself. Nothing would have changed anyway. But with every word the reporter said, his resistance weakened. the report became more and more personal, telling stories he didn't know. Mr. Williams was not only a veteran through his years of service in the armed forces, but also an activist, a fighter for rights, and an advocate for his community. He always stood up for those who suffered injustice, helped young people find purpose and meaning in life. The presenter continued. Archival footage was shown on the screen. Mr. Williams, surrounded by smiling children, participating in a charity event, shaking hands with a young man, supporting him on his way to a new life. Behind each shot was a story of help, support, and kindness. The driver felt a terrible realization boiling up inside him. He had destroyed not just a random person, but someone who had been an example to others all his life, who had brought light and goodness into the lives of others. Every fact about Mr. Williams sounded like a sentence that grew stronger and more inevitable. He realized that he had deprived the world not just of a man, but of a kindness that had always been lacking. And then the anchor added something that made his blood run cold. Mr. Williams has a son who, like his father, is dedicated to serving and protecting people. His son, Detective Marcus Williams, has already arrived in town to take part in the investigation. He is determined to find the culprit and get justice for his father. The driver felt a chasm open up inside him. He knew the name Detective Marcus Williams, one of the most respected cops in the city. His reputation went before him, a man who didn't spare criminals, wouldn't stop until he got justice. The son of his victim wasn't just an ordinary man, it was someone who could and would get to the truth at any cost. His hands trembled, and now he could no longer hide the feeling of panic. The pictures that had once been indifferent to him now returned, taking on a new gravity. He felt more than fear for his freedom. He felt regret rising inside him, the realization that he had destroyed the life of someone who deserved respect and admiration. He sat there, horrified and paralyzed by the thought. Now this crime had a face, a name, and would be avenged. On the screen, faces, animated images, and photographs flashed in succession, painting a portrait of an old man's family, destroyed by the driver's cruel act. These images told the story of Joseph Williams and his loved ones, what it meant to him to be a father, a friend, and a mentor, what kind of man he was to his family, and what a symbol he became to those around him. Joseph Williams was not just an ordinary man, he was what everyone called the father of the neighborhood. His home was always open to those who needed help or advice. For years, he was a source of strength and kindness, generously sharing what he had, and anyone who was ever in his home could feel his hospitality and genuine desire to help. He raised his children on the same principles: respect for people, protection of the weak, fighting for justice. These values were passed on to his son, Detective Marcus Williams, who now headed the investigation of his father's murder. Marcus was Joseph's eldest son and certainly his pride. From childhood, his father taught him to value people not by the color of their skin or their position in society, but by their actions. He had instilled in him his life principles: responsibility, honor, and courage. These lessons helped Marcus become not only an excellent police officer, but also a man of unyielding morals, a man who would never stop until he got justice. His reputation was known far beyond their district. He was a detective who never gave up on a case until it was solved to the end. And now, after learning that his father had fallen victim to a brutal crime, he was ready to do whatever it took to find the culprit. But Marcus was not the only one who reflected his father's principles. Joseph had a daughter, Lauren, who worked as a social worker at a local school. She, too, imbibed the same principles of respect for people and a desire to help. Lauren, unlike her brother, chose a more peaceful path, but her concern for disadvantaged children and her willingness to support each of them in their time of need showed how deeply she respected her father's guidance. For her, the loss of her father was not just a loss, it was the collapse of her own ideal, a man who had always been there to support her in difficult moments. These people were bound together by an unbreakable thread of respect and love, the foundation of which was laid by Joseph Williams. In his home hung old family photographs, many of which he had taken himself. Joseph loved to capture moments so that each one reflected the value of loved ones. His family had been a bastion of goodness, a place where everyone found solace, and now it was all destroyed by one senseless act of cruelty. The driver, shrinking in his seat, watched these images with growing fear. These men, this family, were not just family, they were the voice of the justice that was now upon him. Joseph Williams had been a pillar of peace and truth. His death was not just a loss to his family, but a huge hole that wounded the entire community. He destroyed a man who was respected, and it could not go unnoticed. Through the succession of news and details related to the investigation, dark fragments of the driver's past surfaced that few people knew about. His name, seemingly hidden from the general public, was not news to some people in his entourage. Neighbors, co-workers, and those who had the misfortune to cross paths with him knew him as a man with a sinister temper and dark views of the world, especially when it came to racial differences. His story revealed a violent, frightening side that was unnoticeable at first glance, but hurt many around him. Since his youth, he had shown aggressive tendencies. He had been involved in many conflicts, often raising his hand against those who, in his opinion, were out of line or misbehaving. He had a particularly strong hatred for people of other races, and although he rarely expressed it openly, it seeped out in the form of contemptuous comments, harsh glances, and numerous instances of petty but deliberate humiliation. His views were fueled by a dark, blind hatred that grew over the years. He attended dubious gatherings where racist ideas were openly discussed and often agreed with their aggressive views. These beliefs gave him a sense of superiority, albeit false, allowing him to justify the aggression and harshness with which he treated those around him. In his apartment, old, dark, and always covered with a light dusting of dust, he kept books and magazines with extreme ideologies in a prominent place, which only reinforced his beliefs. In recent years, his record had accumulated several offenses, minor incidents that time and again ended in a rude quarrel, most often with representatives of other nationalities. He intimidated neighbors, threatened his colleagues if they expressed views he didn't like. He was once arrested for a bar fight in which a black man was injured. Although he assured the police that it was self-defense, witnesses said that he was the initiator of the conflict and that his words were full of insults and humiliation. With each passing year, his view of the world grew darker and his hatred more cold and deliberate. He avoided open conflicts with the law, but his inner anger came out in countless small acts of humiliation and rudeness. For him, the world was divided into those who were entitled to respect and those who did not deserve it. He considered himself superior, viewed people of another race with contempt, and always sought to let them know that they were nothing in his eyes. This hatred, deeply rooted and nourished by his beliefs, like a poisonous vine, wrapped itself around his soul, making him alien to all that is light and human. The dark corners of his mind were filled with this blind anger, which one day found an outlet in a cruel act. He saw his racist worldview as the natural order of things, as his mission to put people in their place. His aggression and inability to see humanity in others made him dangerous, creating a dark figure who lived only to humiliate and suppress others. Now that these details were coming out, revealing everything he had tried to hide, the driver was truly uncomfortable. He realized that his past, his dirty beliefs that had long whispered to him that he was right, were turning against him, bringing with them the retribution he deserved. The news screen showed a new, more determined figure, Joseph Williams' son, Detective Marcus Williams. Close-ups of his face, stern and focused, gave viewers a chill for a moment. This was a man of legend, rugged, uncompromising, and always on the side of truth. He had gained a reputation as one of the most incorruptible and unforgiving detectives in the city. And now, looking at the screen, the driver felt a real fear his act attracted the attention of someone who was ready to do anything to get justice. Marcus Williams was not only a son, he was an extension of his father's principles. His entire lifestyle, choice of profession, and personal beliefs were nurtured under the influence of Joseph, who taught him from childhood that true strength lies in honesty, in resilience, and in the desire to protect those who cannot stand up for themselves. From a young age, Marcus knew he wanted to dedicate his life to defending justice and fighting injustice. His colleagues and acquaintances knew that he never left a case unsolved, always bringing an investigation to a conclusion, no matter how much time and effort it took. Marcus was known for his desire for justice, and racially motivated crimes were particularly fierce for him. For him, this was not just part of the job, it was a personal duty. He knew how people felt when they faced humiliation and prejudice on a daily basis, and he could not tolerate those who felt entitled to decide the fate of others on the basis of skin color or ancestry. He saw every incident of racist violence as a personal challenge and was prepared to go all the way to seek retribution. Now the man had lost his father. The news anchor announced that Marcus had already arrived in town, taking charge of the investigation. Footage of Marcus flashed on the screen. A tall, sturdy figure in a dark suit, his gaze determined and hard. His face was hard, as if carved from stone, and there was a hidden strength in his every movement. He did not express his emotions openly, but everyone who knew him understood that beneath this outward restraint lay a rage deep and righteous, the rage of a son who had lost his father in a senseless act of cruelty. The reporter described that Marcus was determined to get justice, that he would not stop until he found the man who had taken his father's life. The town seemed to freeze in anticipation, knowing that a man like Marcus Williams would not back down to anything until just punishment was meted out. He was willing to go to the darkest corners of the underworld, to dig every corner, to look through every camera, to interview every witness, because this was about his family, his memory of the man he loved and respected more than anything else in the world. The driver, staring at the screen, felt a chill creep into his bones. He realized that this was no longer just a random crime that would get lost in a string of other cases. This was a personal challenge for Marcus Williams, a man for whom avenging his father had become a life's work. The driver, gripping the steering wheel tensely, suddenly remembered the one and only encounter he and Marcus Williams had had. It had been several years ago at a local store. The driver had been standing in line at the cash register that day, irritated and angry as usual, looking down on everyone around him. He never liked being in public places crowded with people he considered beneath him. This irritation was exacerbated when a tall, muscular man with dark skin and a confident posture stood in front of him, Marcus Williams. At first, the driver didn't pay much attention to the man, but soon he realized that it was Detective Williams, whom the whole town knew, who was standing next to him. He had heard of him before, stories from colleagues, rumors in the neighborhood, articles in the local newspapers. It was said that this man was not only a skillful policeman, but also deserved the respect of even those who were on the other side of the law. He had an uncommon determination and impeccable integrity that his reputation emphasized. Marcus was someone who was greeted with a respectful nod on the street, someone who exuded confidence and strength by his mere presence. The driver, unaccustomed to such people, felt something strange when he looked at him up close. This man radiated such calm dignity that he had no need to prove his strength with loud words or demonstrative gestures. There was a small quarrel in the queue. One of the buyers, impatiently pushing, tried to get ahead. The driver, irritated and rude, instantly barked something rude in the man's direction. But Marcus, standing nearby, calmly intervened. It was enough for him to say a few words to settle things. The tone of his voice was firm, but without the slightest shadow of aggression. His gaze, calm but intense, disarmed and silenced everyone. Marcus turned and looked at the driver, calmly, but there was a clear and unmistakable power in that look that was read without words. He didn't say a word, but it was as if his presence demanded respect. The driver became uneasy. At that moment he felt that he was standing opposite a man whom he could not break with his anger, nor with his shouting, nor with his threats. This man was the embodiment of everything he hated: strength, confidence, firmness of spirit, but without a trace of arrogance or cruelty. The driver remembered that look for a long time after the incident. Calm, confident and stern, Marcus had that rare ability that allowed him to gain respect without resorting to violence or intimidation. He was a man who didn't need to prove his status. He radiated a calm majesty that had a stronger effect on others than any violence. Now, remembering this moment, the driver realized that back then, in the store, he had met a man who possessed unyielding strength of character. That brief glance from the past made him feel weak and insignificant. Sitting alone in the silence of his apartment, the driver finally realized that he could not hide from the consequences of his deed. Since the morning, he had been tormented by anxiety, which had turned into an agonizing fear that he was realizing for the first time. In his head still echoed the words of the news that Marcus Williams would personally take up his father's case and would not stop until he found the culprit. The news had flooded his mind like an icy wave, making him feel what he had once thought impossible: an animal fear of retribution. He realized more and more clearly with each passing hour that his cruel deed had gone beyond what could be concealed or written off as accidental. That night he had been sure that no one had seen his crime, but now that did not seem such a safeguard. Everything around him, the walls of his apartment, the narrow dark corridors, even the muffled sounds outside the window seemed to hint at his imminent exposure, as if the world was shrinking around him, becoming a trap from which there was no escape. The images replayed endlessly in his mind, the face of Marcus, unwavering and resolute, the same gaze, calm but full of unrelenting will, with which the detective had looked at him in the store. He realized that now that gaze would turn on him, not as a random person, but as a criminal. Marcus would look at him not just as a suspect, but as someone who had destroyed his family, who had dared to infringe on his father's life. The driver clearly realized that there was no hiding from such hatred, and no escape. It would follow him everywhere until he was caught. It seemed to him that every phone call, every rustle outside the door, every random face on the street carried a threat. For the first time in years, he felt defenseless, without any control over what was happening. The same streets he used to think of as safe spaces now made him fearful, as if every passerby could be a potential witness to his guilt. The agonizing, deafening fear of retribution was becoming almost palpable, filling his entire mind. He imagined how Marcus would persistently search for traces, interviewing witnesses, checking cameras, examining every tiny detail until he got to the truth. The driver thought he could already hear police cars approaching, heavy footsteps on the stairs, ready to burst into his world and destroy his life. Even the air in the room became dense and stuffy, without an escape route. Every minute seemed to become an eternity. Filled with fear, he could no longer sit still. His thoughts kept returning to that fateful night, to that could not be undone. He realized that this act was now his sentence, a stigma that could not be washed away. Soon after the news of Mr. Williams' tragedy spread through the city, the driver began to notice that people around him were looking at him differently. At first, it was just looks, brief, wary, sometimes contemptuous. He felt that something had changed, as if everyone around him knew something he could not understand. Every glance he met caused him a growing uneasiness. It seemed to him that everyone around him saw something in him that had remained hidden before. In a small town where everyone knew each other, Mr. Williams' death came as a shock to everyone. People were grieving, discussing what had happened in stores, on the streets, and in cafes. His name was in every conversation, and every day the story took on new and frightening details. They spoke of him as a victim of senseless violence, a symbol of kindness who had been brutally robbed of his life. People were outraged that the killer had not yet been found, that someone had so brutally murdered someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. The driver noticed how his colleagues at work began to avoid him, as if they sensed something unpleasant coming from him. No one looked him in the eye. Conversation stopped when he entered the room, and whispers were heard behind his back. It seemed to him that even the random people he encountered on the street or in the store looked at him with a kind of judgment, as if they knew he had blood on his hands. He couldn't tell if it was a figment of his imagination or if people were guessing something. Rumors began to creep through the city like a dark cloud. Some confidently claimed that the police were already on the trail of the killer, that they had a suspect in hiding. Others said the crime had been committed by a man long known in the city for his racist views and aggression. People began stringing together random details, recalling old conflicts, outbursts of anger and antics they had previously preferred to keep quiet about. Those who knew his bad temper were now mentioning it more and more often in conversations, adding more and more unflattering details about his behavior. Every day he felt as if the city was shrinking around him, creating invisible walls through which the old familiar life no longer penetrated. The driver was afraid to leave the house. In every look, in every whisper, he felt judgment and contempt. His neighbors, who had once greeted him with a nod of the head or a short phrase, now turned away as if they did not notice him at all. He was a stranger to them, and every step they took, every glance, pushed him farther and farther away from the rest of the world, making him an outcast, an untouchable whose presence was reviled and hated. He felt that these rumors, this condemnation, was beginning to eat him up from the inside out. People didn't know exactly, but their dislike, their contempt, was already filling every corner of his life, pushing him to the edge of the abyss from which there was no return. One evening, when the sun was already hiding behind the horizon, flooding the streets with gloomy shadows. The driver heard a heavy knock on his door. It was an insistent, commanding knock that made his heart freeze for a moment and his palms sweat. He did not have to wonder who might be behind the door. He already knew it was the end. He walked slowly to the door and, opening it reluctantly, came face to face with Marcus Williams. The son of his victim stood on the threshold, tall and confident, and his presence seemed to fill the entire narrow hallway. Marcus' face was impassive, but his eyes, dark and cold, reflected genuine determination. This was a man who had come to seek justice and retribution not by law, but by the right of a son who had lost his father in a senseless act of cruelty. Marcus stared at him silently, and the driver felt his gut clench under that gaze. There were no words of forgiveness in that silence, no shadow of pity, only a quiet, restrained rage that seemed almost palpable, as if every look he gave him was cutting the driver to pieces. He knew that before him stood a man for whom nothing was more important than justice, and that this man would not stop until he saw that the guilty man had paid in full for his deed. Finally, Marcus spoke, and his voice was steady, calm, but as cold as a knife blade. Did you think you could hide? Did you think no one would ever know what you did? But I'm here to tell you one thing. I will never forgive you for this. You took away my father, the man who was everything to me and to this town. You have no idea how many people are suffering because of what you did. Every word Marcus said was like a blow, slow but inexorable. The driver tried to turn away, to avoid his gaze, but he couldn't. Something held him, forcing him to listen to every word, as if it were a sentence he couldn't escape. It seemed to him that with every second the gaze penetrated deeper, exposing all his weaknesses and fears. Marcus continued, his voice sounding like an icy whisper, full of contempt. You took away someone who was my rock, and you think I'm just going to forget? That I'll accept it. I won't stop until I get justice. And even if justice doesn't punish you the way you deserve, I'll find a way to remind you every day what you've done. His words were full of determination, devoid of vengeance, but imbued with the firmness of a man who had come to repay a debt. Even if it took his whole life to do so, the driver found it unbearable to stand before him. He tried to say something, to squeeze out words of justification or apology, but his throat constricted and the words stuck somewhere deep inside. Marcus stood opposite him, as still as a stone statue, his whole being radiating the cold determination that characterizes a man who fears neither darkness, nor pain, nor loneliness. The driver realized that there was no escape from this man, that no matter how he tried to hide, Marcus would follow him like a shadow, like a curse left by himself. You see what payback means, Marcus whispered in conclusion, and his words seemed to soak the air in the room, leaving their mark in it. Left alone after his meeting with Marcus, the driver felt all his former confidence crumble like a house of cards. He closed the door, leaning back against it, and felt a cold shiver run through his body from which there was no escape. The room had been dark and quiet, but now even that silence, which had once brought him peace, seemed filled with menacing shadows. It was as if he could feel Marcus's presence, his fixed gaze, his words that were forever embedded in the walls. Every corner of the apartment seemed alien to him now, cold, as if even his own home rejected him. As if knowing what he had done, he walked slowly to the back of the room, sank down on the armchair, and covered his face with his hands, trying to shut out the disturbing thoughts. But they were persistent, like black birds circling his mind, leaving no glimmer of hope. Now that Marcus's revenge seemed inevitable, he felt the fear that he himself had once felt of Marcus's father in front of his car. His hands trembled, and everything in his chest clenched with the realization that there was no turning back, that everything he had done had turned against him. For the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable, weak, like he was trapped in a cage with no way out. Every sound seemed a threat to him. Now the quiet creak of floorboards, the distant rumble of cars outside the window, even the sound of his own footsteps terrified him. He imagined Marcus gathering evidence, interviewing people, finding more and more evidence of his guilt. With each step toward exposure, the driver felt more and more cornered. The picture of his own exposure, of his face on newspaper pages and news screens, of the courtroom and prison bars, haunted him even with his eyes closed. In his mind he went back to that night, to his crime, trying to find at least a shred of justification. But it was all in vain. He could no longer justify himself, and it was unbearable. Now, knowing that his deed would not disappear, he felt doomed. As if condemned to eternal fear, he wondered painfully how long it would be before his world finally collapsed, before Marcus got his way. The despair and hopelessness seized him with renewed vigor. The future seemed dark and inevitable, and no matter what he did, there was no way out of this vicious circle. Marcus Williams knew that in order to get justice for his father's death, he had to go to extreme measures. He realized that despite the internal evidence and personal suspicions, he needed to bring the crime to public attention so that no one would dare to silence the case or allow the perpetrator to escape. Marcus decided to use his reputation and the power of his voice to get truth and justice. He sprang into action immediately, and his steps were deliberate and focused. Marcus gave several interviews to the local news, talking about his father, the kind of man he was, and the void his loss had left in the lives of his family and the entire town. He wasn't afraid to use personal and emotional details as he shared his memories with reporters, telling how his father, Joseph, spent his entire life dedicated to others, helping those in need, and supporting local residents. Marcus's voice trembled when he said that he had lost not only his father, but also his hero, the one who taught him to fight for truth and justice. "I will not allow my father's murder to go unsolved. I will do everything in my power to make the perpetrator answer for what he has done," Marcus said in one of his first interviews. These words sounded like a challenge not only to the driver, but also to all those who tried to silence or cover up the crime. From that moment on, the case gained public attention, and the city began to follow every step of the investigation. Marcus turned for help to local activists and community organizations to get justice. They organized a rally in the center of the city, where many people gathered, friends and acquaintances of Joseph Williams, those whom he had helped over the years, as well as simply concerned citizens outraged by the cruelty and injustice. Marcus stood before the crowd and openly called for justice to be served, for no one to remain indifferent to this tragedy. There was strength, genuine pain, and unrelenting determination in his words. "We all knew my father as an honest, kind man who did not deserve this fate. This town has lost more than just a resident. We've lost the heart of our community, and whoever deprived us of him must be held accountable for what he has done." Marcus spoke from the podium, and his words resonated with the people who came to support his fight. Every new day, Marcus used his position and reputation to draw attention to the identity of the alleged perpetrator, not naming him, but clearly describing what he had done. Pictures of the driver began to appear in the news. People increasingly discussed him, and the city began to talk about the man as the prime suspect. Public condemnation escalated when local newspapers and news sites picked up the story, publishing articles and updates covering every detail of the investigation. Joseph Williams' image, story, and portraits alongside "Justice for Joseph" posters became a symbol of popular outrage. For the driver, this public exposure was a nightmare. Everywhere he went, he heard whispers, saw judgmental stares, felt the city unite against him. He realized that people no longer saw him as a normal person, that he was now the embodiment of cruelty and senseless violence in the eyes of the public. The day came when it was all over for the driver. Early in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight barely illuminated his apartment, he heard loud footsteps and muffled voices outside the door. His heart sank and a cold shiver ran through his body. He knew this moment was inevitable, but he had hoped to the last minute that he would somehow escape punishment. However, everything pointed to the fact that justice had caught up with him. The knock on the door sounded imperious, like a sentence. The driver approached, his hands shaking, and he felt his throat dry. He opened the door and immediately saw the familiar, unyielding face of Detective Marcus Williams, who stood in the doorway with a cold, focused expression. Behind Marcus stood several police officers, and determination was read on all of their faces. Everyone seemed to know who this man was and what he had done, their eyes full of judgment and contempt. Marcus did not utter a word, but his gaze spoke more than any accusation. The driver felt that he could not even meet his eyes. That under that gaze, filled with grief, anger, and satisfaction, he was becoming insignificant. Small, the policeman stepped forward and, pulling out the handcuffs, spoke short, cold words. "You are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Joseph Williams. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." Those words finally shattered his inner resistance. He felt the handcuffs snap on his wrists, the cold metal squeeze in his hands, and that deafening click was the symbol of the end of his freedom, of his former life. It seemed to him that with each step as he was led to the car, his whole world was crumbling like a house of cards. What had seemed immutable before had dissolved in an instant. The neighbors were out on the landing, staring at him, some whispering, some gazing with outright hatred. He felt these stares like arrows penetrating him. People who had once been merely his entourage were now witnessing his downfall, final and inevitable. They knew he was a murderer, that he was the very man who had ruined the life of their respected neighbor, their friend, and none of them tried to hide their contempt. When they put him in the police car, he had time to glance once more at Marcus, who stood to the side, his gaze fixed on him. There was no rage in that gaze, only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a man who had finally achieved justice. Marcus knew that this day would be payback for his father's death, and he saw before him the man who had robbed him of what he held most dear. The police car moved off, and the driver felt his reputation, his former life, everything he had once considered his untouchable territory, left far behind, shattered to the ground. From that moment on, he was not just a criminal, but a social pariah, a man who had stained his name not only before the law, but in the eyes of all who knew of his crime. After the driver's arrest and months of investigation, the day of the trial came. The hall was filled with people who had come to see justice served. In the front rows Saturday Joseph Williams' family members, friends and neighbors, those he had helped and supported during his lifetime. At the center of attention was Marcus Williams, the son of the slain man, who became a symbol of the fight for justice and retribution. Everyone knew that it was his efforts that led to the arrest and exposure of the perpetrator, and today everyone waited for his words, his decision. When the judge gave the floor to Marcus, there was complete silence in the hall. All eyes were fixed on him, and even the driver, sitting on the bench, could not take his eyes off the man, his cold and seemingly unyielding face. He knew that his fate was now being decided, and it was not the judge, not the jury, but Marcus who had in his hands the power that could either grant pardon or utterly destroy him. Marcus stood up, his figure firm and confident, and his voice calm, but in that calmness, you could feel the strength of a man who had been through personal pain and deep reflection. He began to talk about his father, about the kind of man Joseph was, how he always believed in goodness and justice, how he never lost faith in people, even in the most difficult circumstances. Marcus told how his father taught him that a person's strength lies not in cruelty, but in the ability to forgive, even if it seems impossible. My father always said that forgiveness was the choice of the strong, Marcus said, and his words hung in the air, making everyone present think. He believed that people could change, that even the most violent could realize their mistakes and begin the path to redemption. Marcus paused and seemed to weigh his next words. There was a tense silence in the hall. The driver felt his heart pounding in his chest and his hands growing cold with anticipation. He knew that behind this silence hid a decision that would determine his entire future fate. He had never believed in forgiveness, never thought it could be his salvation, but now his world was shaking. For the first time, he felt that forgiveness was the only chance for relief. But forgiveness isn't just absolution, Marcus continued, his gaze impenetrable, but you could hear the unrelenting strength in his voice. Forgiveness must be earned. Forgiveness requires repentance and atonement. I cannot simply forgive the man who robbed me of my father, who treated human life with such contempt. These words came like a blow to the driver. He felt that Marcus had offered him the hardest path, the path on which he had to bear the burden of his deed to the end. This was not a soft forgiveness. This was not a simple punishment. It was an opportunity to reflect on his actions and realize their depth, a chance to look into the darkest part of his soul. Marcus appealed to the court, asking that the sentence be not so much harsh as just, that the driver be deprived of his liberty and forced to spend years in reflection, but not the death penalty. He wanted him to spend his days realizing the pain he had caused and the lives he had destroyed, so that day after day, he would have to face his own mistakes and realize the depth of them. Forgiveness or punishment, Marcus chose something third, a solution that included both sides. He didn't seek revenge, but it didn't let the crime go without consequences either. His choice was an act of true justice, reflecting the power of forgiveness and the need for accountability. The story is over, but its consequences remain in the hearts of those who witnessed the tragedy. A brutal act born of blind hatred and prejudice, not only destroyed the lives of Joseph Williams and his family, but also changed the fate of the driver himself forever. He found himself in dark isolation, not only physically but mentally, forced to face the inescapable truth of his own mistakes again and again. His hatred, his inability to see human beings as human beings led him to a bottom from which there was no return. Marcus, Joseph's son, embodied a different path, a path of forgiveness, based on a deep understanding of justice. He did not choose violent revenge. Despite his personal pain and tragedy, he showed that the power of true forgiveness and justice is not to humiliate or destroy, but to allow one to rethink one's actions. Marcus realized that to destroy the driver, no matter how much his grieving soul craved it, would mean losing in the face of the very hatred that had ruined his father. He chose a different path, showing the humanity and strength his father had instilled in him. The story of this tragedy reminded everyone that hatred is blind and destructive. It knows neither boundaries nor excuses, and the more of it there is in the heart, the less room there is for peace, respect, and understanding. Hate, whether it is directed at one person or a whole group of people, turns a person into a slave, a ruthless instrument of destruction that hurts not only others but also himself. The driver who let hate rule his mind lost everything: freedom, respect, and most importantly, his very human essence, because he forgot a simple truth: every person, regardless of skin color, deserves respect and dignity. This story was a reminder that the world will not change until people learn to see themselves in each person, to appreciate what they have in common instead of looking for differences. The driver's cruel act destroyed one life, but inflicted an unhealed wound on an entire community. And now, anyone who hears this story might wonder what will become of the world if we let hate rule us. In the finale of this story, the main lesson remains: a real person is one who sees the humanity in others, who refuses to give in to blind hatred and seeks understanding even where it is hard to find it. Hate destroys and destroys, but forgiveness and love heal. Thank you for watching this story to the end. We know topics like this aren't easy, but they're incredibly important to discuss. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of this story? Perhaps you or someone you love has experienced bias or racism. Your stories and opinions are important to us, as each comment helps us better understand how issues like this affect us all. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for being with us, for supporting our channel, and for sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and send this video to anyone you think might benefit from it. We wish you a good day.